Hello everyone, welcome to this event. Just to tell you, we are waiting a few minutes for people to join, and we'll begin in a few minutes. Thanks. Hello again, everyone. Warm welcome to this civil society side event on the UN tax convention process. I am Lison Rebinder. I work for the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, and I'm happy to be moderating this side event with great civil society colleagues to present our views and our expectations on the upcoming negotiations. Please note that this is a live stream on Web UN TV, so this is a public event. And we are a large group of civil society here, and I think I can speak for all of us to say that we are very excited for this process and very excited to follow this negotiation. This is truly a historical moment. We have been campaigning for years for tax negotiations to be brought to the UN, to allow for truly universal discussions with each and every country at the table, and to allow for real negotiations to rewrite the rules, the deeply flawed and unjust global tax rules. So we are very excited, and we are also very conscious that these negotiations happens at a very crucial moment. The country desperately need public resources to fund for gender transformative public services, to fight the global climate crisis, to guarantee the realization of human rights. This process is a unique opportunity to create an international tax system that would allow countries to collect these crucial public resources. It's a unique opportunity to transform a system that is still deeply unjust for countries of the global south, rooted in colonization and depriving them of taxing rights. And as civil society, we are a large group and we have proposals. We have demands to make this convention really efficient and fair. We have worked together with a large group on our submissions. You can see our detailed propositions, and we need a fair and equitable, progressive, effective, inclusive, sustainable, and transparent UN tax convention. So to discuss with this and to present to you our proposal and demands today, we have Tove Riding of the European Network on Debt and Development, Nathalie Béguin of INESC, Latindad and Red Justicia Fiscal de Latinoamérica y el Caribbean, sorry for the accent, Evelyn Muendo from Tax Justice Network Africa, and Tony Salvador for the Third World Network. So I will first give the floor to Tove. And Tove, can you share with us the expectation regarding the UN Tax Convention itself, which is the focus on this first week of negotiation, also the focus of Workstream 1. So what are civil society main demands on the content of the convention, but also the structure and its relation to early and subsequent protocols?
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for coming. Indeed, we have been campaigning for a UN tax process for many, many years. And one of the things we used to be told was that you can't discuss tax at the United Nations because there are no tax experts. And we tried to say, well, can't they come and show up at the United Nations? And it turned out that they definitely could. We now have a room that is very full of tax experts, including from the civil society side. So the UN is learning a lot from the world of tax, and that is great. But the world of tax also has a lot to learn from the UN in terms of global governance. What this building does, what it is set up to do, is basically to lead international and intergovernmental negotiations and construct frameworks for global governance. And if you look at what we brought with us when we tax people arrived, you will see the most interesting spaghetti of rules and treaties. And if we had a world competition of the most messy international governance system, I would submit the tax system. We're looking at first over 3,000 bilateral tax treaties, some of them dating back to before colonialism ended, some of them being extremely outdated. On top of these bilateral tax treaties are then some international standards that at best have been partially implemented. They were written at the OECD, and that always brought the concern that they were also written in favor of the OECD. So as a consequence, there was a lot of reluctance by other countries to introduce these standards. Then there were different types of legal instruments added on top of the bilateral tax treaties, but the way they are constructed is that countries submit a list of which of their bilateral tax treaties they want to see covered and which not. And if two countries then choose the same bilateral tax treaty to be covered, then it's covered. But then underneath that, they can choose that some of the articles should apply and others not. And so if the countries then choose the same articles to apply, then that applies to that specific tax convention. That has created a fascinating matrix that you can find on the OECD website to see which countries follow which parts of the OECD rules, including the BEPS multilateral legal framework. It's not a surprise that this is not working. It's not a surprise that this is not effective. And large-scale international tax abuse is one consequence of this. But when we get to the discussion about disputes, you will see another consequence, which is that there are a huge amount of conflicts between countries about how this international tax system should apply, because the fact of the matter is that we have never had a truly global tax framework. We have never had clear objectives for international tax cooperation, clear principles, clear commitments, and this impacts everybody. we don't usually have many things where we agree with international business, but one of the points that we do actually agree on is that this incredible mess is not sustainable. Business come to the table with the demand to have certainty about the level of taxes that they will pay. We actually ask the same, but it's just very different rates that we have in mind. But the fact of the matter is that the conflicts between countries create a very, very large level of uncertainty. So we need a solution to this. When we saw the terms of reference last year, we were extremely excited. We have a very, very strong and solid objective for these negotiations. Not only is it to create a legitimate and coherent and effective global framework, but this is the second thing. We're also putting it in the context of all the other things that are going on in this building. We're now on the mission to create an international tax system for sustainable development. And if you look at what goes on in this building, you will see governments sitting and negotiating everything from development and education, healthcare, environmental protection. There's a long list of negotiations that all have one thing in common. Whenever they get to the question about how to finance these commitments, the negotiations break down or become extremely difficult. I've been following these processes for over 20 years now, and the one request I have is when we talk about finding new money, can we please not call it new and additional resources, because it's not really new. We've been discussing the same sources for years. We often call them innovative. It's not really innovative. There are these ideas, can we put a tax on financial transaction? Can we put a tax on boats or on planes? And what we come with, the message as a tax movement is that, sure, but that's peanuts. If you start repairing the global tax system, the first thing you get is you get a group of governments that can start collecting money again. Secondly, you can also look at developing these type of global tax mechanisms, which are actually not news. They have been discussed by all governments in these buildings for years. But what they have had is a lack of knowledge about tax and the lack of a framework where these ideas can get picked up. So to come to the point of your question, what do we need in this UN tax convention? Well, a framework convention, if you read the climate convention or all the other many framework conventions that the UN already has, that's not an empty convention. Framework conventions are very strong on issues like the objectives. They often contain a lot of commitments. If you look at the climate convention, it has pages after pages of commitments. So a framework convention has content, and that's what gives the COP its mandate. Furthermore, framework conventions can and should adopt protocols, but not on every issue. When you adopt a protocol, you set up a separate governance system. You have a new group of signatories. It becomes complex. And maybe it's in the nature of us as tax people to think the more protocols and treaties, the better. That's not the case if you want a coherent global system. So as much as we can, we should aim to handle things under the convention, including by having commitments that are clear and strong enough to give a mandate to the COP to hash out the details and be the implementation mechanism. The more we can avoid to have separate protocols for everything, the more we will have a sustainable and coherent system for the future. The second thing that's key for framework conventions is mechanisms. Again, you can look at the climate convention. There are mechanisms for issues like finance that didn't work so well. But in the issue of tax, it would also be very obvious to look at mechanisms for transparency. So we also need to look at what mechanisms can we set up under the convention. And lastly, the issue of subsidiary bodies is also something you often see covered by framework conventions. So those are the ideas that we tabled, in fact, already years ago, but now we're bringing them back because finally we have a negotiation where these ideas can turn into reality. And this is not a north-south issue. This is not a question about which political camp you're in. This is just a question of proper governance of an issue that is so important, namely international taxation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tove. And as a representative of a European organization, what could you share about your analysis of the positions of European countries so far in the negotiation, but also the expectations toward them as the negotiation truly begin now?
Yes, I think the position of European countries has diversified a bit as far as we can see. One thing we do hear a lot is firstly, duplication. We have never acknowledged that whole discussion because we've never had a truly global tax system before. And secondly, we still hear some European governments say that the most important thing is to implement the OECD's Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Pillar 1 is designed such that, and this says a lot about the OECD, there's one country that's been given the power to veto it. Because if the United States doesn't sign on to Pillar 1, there is no Pillar 1, and Trump has been very clear, there is no Pillar 1. When it comes to Pillar 2, it's designed so that countries can implement it on their own and move forward, and very few countries have. But the EU has implemented Pillar 2, and we've been calling on the EU to look at this again, because it's actually quite harmful even for EU countries, because it's a very ineffective rule system, but also because it mainly brings more taxing rights, or de facto it brings tax income to tax havens. So it's even damaging high tax countries within the European Union. But recently we saw the G7 come out, and the G7, it's very serious in the OECD when they make a decision, because we've seen in the past that if the G7 says this is the OECD agreement, that's often how it turns out. And the G7 had a meeting where they had agreed that the Pillar 2 rules should not apply to the United States. You have no idea how unfair this is. The United States were the main pen holders when Pillar 2 was negotiated. And I think that that goes for the Global North Group in general, is that the OECD, the way the OECD negotiations have happened has been the US first. The US first when the rules get written, the US first out the door when it's time for implementation. And the way this building usually works, you see it in many UN negotiations, is a US last strategy. The rest of the world negotiates a coherent global framework. The US is warmly welcome to participate on an equal footing, but often the US does not. But what we have seen in other conventions is also that when the rest of the world starts moving forward, eventually the US will follow as well. So these are some of the issues. And the last one we're still hearing is that we need consensus in the decision making. I don't understand why that has never been raised in the OECD, because a third of the world's countries were never there. And even among the countries there was never a consensus. There were always countries disagreeing. But also now that we saw the US leave in February, obviously it's quite clear we do not have consensus. The US would be happy to come back and veto everything and stop this. Very obviously, we're not going to say yes to that.
Thank you, Tove, and I hope we will continue this discussion in the follow-up. And now to you, Nathalie. So you come from a region where progressivity is a big issue, big discussions, taxation of the wealthy. So what can you share of the perspective of Latin American countries?
Sorry. Thank you very much, Lison. Thank you very much for all of you that are here with us. So I will speak on behalf of Latin American Fiscal Justice Network and also Latinda. We have some representatives of ours here. Adrian is from Latinda in the Latin American Network. So please, you say to me if I'm okay. So I would like to share with you like two kind of messages we have discussed in the region regarding the UN Tax Convention. One is how to connect the outcomes, the severe outcomes with the convention, because there are some really interesting things over there. And I would like to highlight 5 quickly of those outcomes and how it would be great if they could enter in the convention. The first one regards human rights. So the Sevilla Compromiso, which is the main document in Sevilla of the 54, says, we further reaffirm that the pursuit and enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, encompassing civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, which include the right to development, must be respected, protected, and promoted without distinction of discrimination of any kind. So in our understanding, tax policies are bound up with government's human rights obligations. And the human rights standards provide a critical benchmark for evaluating tax systems and emphasize the need for international tax cooperation to close inequalities and ensure governments that can fulfill their human rights obligation. So this connection or strengthening the human rights dimension in the convention is really important. The second issue is gender justice. The Compromiso de Sevilla says we reaffirm the imperative of achieving gender equality. We will develop and enhance methodologies and tools for designing, monitoring, and evaluating budgets with a gender perspective. Since budgets are constitute of tax incomes and expenses, the gender perspective should also be a very important element for the UN Tax Convention. So for us, the UN Tax Convention should serve as a reference for transforming the international tax system, moving away from the colonial and patriarchal practices that have perpetuated the subordination of vulnerable groups. At Latinda and the Latin American Network on Tax Justice, we believe that fiscal justice is a very important element to promote transformative care systems, which are crucial to assure gender equity. And for the right of care not to be a dead letter, it must be financed with progressive, timely, and sufficient revenues, distributing the cost between states, the private sector, and those who have historically supported care with their time and bodies, which are women. The third message or the third issue is progressivity and inequality. The Compromiso de Sevilla says, we will promote progressivity and efficiency across fiscal systems to address inequality and increase revenue. And for us, progressive tax systems are fundamental to tackle inequalities that are growing between and within countries. And we all know that rich people don't pay their fair share of taxes, and the tax burden of taxation falls on the poorest. So it is really fundamental to reduce the proportion of indirect taxation and at the same time to increase taxes of the wealthiest. We believe that tax justice is fundamental to mobilizing additional resources to financial tax justice. The fourth issue is fight illicit financial flows. And the Compromiso de Sevilla says, we will prevent and combat illicit financial flows. And so again, since the loss of billions of dollars every year from our budget are compromising the full realization of human rights, we really believe that ending tax havens and loopholes that promote the financial flows and the illicit financial flows and tax abuses are central to promote the human rights. And in Latin America, this is really important because tax abuse amounts to 7% of our GDP. So it's a lot of money that we could reallocate to promote human rights. And the last item, we think it's important, it's tax justice for climate justice. So the Compromiso de Sevilla says, we will promote the consideration of the environment, biodiversity, climate, disaster risk, food security, nutrition and sustainability of agri-food system in fiscal programming. While respecting national sovereignty, options may include green budgeting, taxation and fiscal rules, and taxes on environmental contamination and pollution. So from our organizations in the region, we reinforce the tax polluter system principle, and we strongly support proposals like the one that is being elaborated by Eurogad and partners regarding a surtax on fossil fuels industries' profits. And we also believe that environmental taxes at national and global level should promote the progressivity of the system. So we already talked about that, so I'm just agreeing with that. And so for us, the tax system and the international cooperation on tax should mobilize in a progressive way new additional, in this case, new additional accessible resources to finance climate justice. And the second message, and this is my last point, is regarding social participation in tax policies. So we believe that social participation is crucial for various reasons, and I would mention 5. The first one is representation, because we, social organizations and movements, are among the most concerned by tax injustice. We are among those that are deeply affected by aggressive tax evasion, and our states lose a lot of money because of that that measures, and so that is why we are connected to this agenda, because a just and progressive tax system at global level and national level could promote human rights and finance climate change. So for us, the first reason to have social participation in the whole process is not only at international level, but also at national level, is representation. The second one is legitimacy, because by incorporating our demands, the process will be politically more robust. And because we know that what tax injustice represents, we live it in our skin, in our communities, in our countries. So civil society organizations make governments more responsive to social demands. The third reason is quality of proposal. We also have the skills to formulate, though we already said that, to formulate highly technical proposals, since we've been working on tax policies for forever. The fourth reason is inclusiveness. For the convention to be really truly inclusive, of course, it has to include in the same level all the countries, but also the communities that are affected by tax injustice. So inclusiveness, it's more than only one country, one vote. It's also including civil society. And the last issue is regarding transparency. So we believe that civil society participation is important because it assures transparency, because we try to translate what is happening here, what is happening in our countries, to other communities and groups. And so this also gives legitimacy to the process. So it's like one reason reinforces the other. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Nati. Thank you for stressing how this process is about tax, but not only about tax, it's also about gender justice, environmental justice, and we are very happy as civil society to be able to participate and contribute to it. And now to you, Evelyn. Very pleasure to have you here. We know that the corporate tax system is really a central issue of this debate. And within the corporate tax system, the fair allocation of taxing rights. So can you share with us your analysis and the expectation of civil society on these issues?
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, Madam Chair. I can't shake off the formality of the main room. So corporate taxation and the fair allocation of taxing rights is indeed very important for Africa as a continent. And so that I can answer why effectively, I'll start by explaining the economic models that many African countries have. So for many of us, we have large informal sectors, and we will not get into the politics of taxation of the informal sector. And then we have a very small section of what we call the middle class that is formally employed. Now, when you analyze the tax revenue that most governments are able to collect, the bulk of it comes from, number one, personal income taxes. So people like me. And then the bulk of it also comes from value-added taxes. And we aren't getting as much as we should from corporate income taxes, and that is for a number of reasons. So when you talk about sharing the tax burden fairly, in a lot of African countries, what happens is that we end up having increased taxes on the formerly employed. So for instance, I am paying taxes as if I come from a socialist country, but I'm not getting the public services that I would get in a socialist country. You understand? Like around, let's say, 40-something% of my salary, but not the public services. It's still out of pocket. So the reasons why many African governments do this is because it's easier to administer personal income taxes, and it's easier to administer value-added taxes. Oh, and we haven't counted the amount of consumption taxes I pay. We've only looked at the income taxes, just so I can mention. As a Kenyan taxpayer, I had to say that. Yes, so it's easier to administer consumption taxes as well as personal income taxes in African countries than it is to chase corporates in order to make them pay their fair share of taxes. So now, as someone who's worked on tax justice, I realized we need to shift attention particularly to corporate income taxes for several reasons. Number one is because we experience and we bear the brunt of tax avoidance practices and illicit financial flows more heavily than developed countries do. And I think extensive research has been done on this within the continent. So you have the high-level panel report on illicit financial flows that was released in 2015, which was commissioned by the African Union, as well as the UNECA, the UN Economic Commission of Africa. You also have the UNCTAD report of 2020, which gave us a volume of these commercial-driven illicit financial flows and how they're impacting Africa. So you have that situation. Number two, you also have that situation where African countries aren't able to raise revenue through corporate income taxes because of the resident source principle and how it came to be and how it's evolved within our double taxation agreements as countries. Now, when they were formulating the resident source principle, they were formulating these rules not with African countries in mind. This was between countries that have almost the same economic weight. And so source residents really worked at that time because these are two countries that were coming together to formulate a double taxation agreement, and they had almost equal weight, okay? But that is not the case with African countries. We have an extractivist development model. We export primary commodities, we don't even value add them within the continent, and then we import them to use it as consumers, of course, at an added cost. And it's not just with commodities, you'll also see this with services. Now, services are very important for the African continent. I think as I stated yesterday in my statement, I said that services add economic value to developing countries up to 61%. However, at the same time, we are net importers of services. So this means if Africa does not figure out taxation of non-resident corporates, we will continue having unfair tax systems, which are actually causing political turmoil, as has been evidenced in countries such as Kenya, and of course, what we call the resource curse, unfortunately, in countries such as the DRC. We have resources, we have labor forces, we have all these things that should make us successful, but we've never until this day been able to leverage on them for our own development. And so we ended up turning to debt, but that's another conversation. So you can see why corporate taxation and why addressing the fair allocation of taxing rights is very, very, very important for African countries. It's very, very important. And I know the argument is, well, African countries gained political independence, and we have been negotiating double taxation agreements for quite a while. So why do we keep giving concessions within our double taxation agreements? Why do we keep giving away our taxing rights? I'll answer it very simply. It's about bargaining power. We are at the table looking for foreign direct investment so that we can exploit our own resources. And so, of course, we're using tax policy as one of the ways in which to attract investment. And it's not just that we offer this, it's also demanded from us by investors. And if you look very closely, if you've done any level of studies on double taxation agreements, TGNA has done quite extensive studies on double taxation agreements in the East African community. The Center for Studies on African Taxation has done the same within West Africa. I know Oxfam has done some within Southern Africa, amongst others. You will notice that double taxation agreements are not arrived at simply for the purpose of avoiding double taxation. In fact, that's like one of those subsidiary auxiliary reasons. The main reason really is that it's a result of economic and investment relations that we're setting up. So of course we don't have bargaining power. So of course this has perpetuated to the imbalance of taxing rights and has taken away our ability to effectively tax non-resident corporates more and more and more. And right now we're in this situation where we barely have, was it around 14% tax to GDP? That is the, I don't think it's the average, it's the median tax to GDP ratio of African countries in comparison to others who have 34%, who have 26%. We have only 14%. And so that's one challenge. And so we realized as African countries that even our attempts to introduce productive and more progressive provisions within double taxations, particularly through the UN model, is not working. And I'll give you a very simple example. The taxation of technical services. This is a provision that is, very unique to the UN model. And yet there has only been 29% uptake of this provision. So you go to the negotiating table. I won't mention the countries, but you know yourselves. You know your negotiating styles. You go to the negotiating table and they simply refuse to have a section on technical services. They simply refuse to amend Article 8 of these double taxation agreements so that source countries, which of course are capital importing countries, African countries, can also have the right to tax the income that arises from shipping services, amongst others. So these are challenges that African countries have continued facing. So we realized we needed a multilateral approach where we can bargain as a collective in order to rewrite international tax rules and in order to move towards a system where source countries are also able to effectively tax income that is arising from economic activities in our countries. I always find it so funny. We don't want to take income that is arising from residence countries. These are economic activities that are happening in our countries. They use our labor forces, they use our public infrastructure. They also benefit from our consumers. They benefit from the market that we provide for them. But then the way the international tax rules are structured right now is that we don't have taxing rights on a lot of this income that arises from a lot of these economic activities from our countries. And so that is highly, highly problematic. And that's why we want to rewrite the tax rules. Now, we've seen efforts to also address tax avoidance. We've seen efforts to avoid aggressive tax avoidance. We've seen, for instance, BEPS. And you saw quite a number of countries, African countries particularly, that actually joined these processes with the intention of participating in good faith and benefiting from them. So for instance, you have around 27 African countries that are actually members of the inclusive framework, despite the fact that they were not there during the formulation of BEPS, despite the fact that they had to accept the 4 minimum standards, even if it wasn't speaking to their priorities or their realities at the time. African countries still participated in these processes. Even in the formulation of the two-pillar solution on the challenges, the tax challenges that arise from the digitalization of the economy, African countries still took part very consistently and to the best of their efforts. And by the way, it is not free to participate in the inclusive framework. We have to pay around 30,000 euros, if I'm not wrong, on an annual basis in order to take place. So it's not a charitable thing that we're participating in. We are actually paying money in order to take part in standards that were not set for us. The ironies of life. Anyway, and so what happened, and what I find quite interesting, is that the solutions that keep coming out of these processes that were not made for us or by us are not speaking to the realities of many African countries. And consistently, you saw entities such as ETA provide comments, for instance, on Pillar 1 when it was still young. You saw entities provide comments on Globe. We say that the global minimum tax rate is too low, 15% is not enough. Please, let's raise it. We aren't comfortable with amount A. Why are we only targeting residual profits? Why is it only, was it 10%? Amongst other issues. Why do you want us to drop digital services taxes? You know, why do you want us to drop our unilateral measures? So we saw African countries participate in these processes, and they actually voiced their concerns, but their concerns were still not adequately addressed. And if you look very carefully, the people who ended up advocating for the UN Framework Convention were actually the countries that participated the most during the inclusive process, the inclusive framework processes. So thank you, OECD. You did what we couldn't do as civil society for 10 years. You gave our countries finally the political will to seek another more inclusive forum. We owe it all to you. And so what ended up happening is you had countries like Kenya and Nigeria reject the implementation of the two-pillar solution, and they gave very, very practical reasons as to why. Because these solutions were never made with the level of capacity, with the level of capacity of African tax administrations in mind. They also did not reflect the priorities of many African countries. And so we decided, let's find another forum and let's develop international tax rules for the first time in over a century, which actually takes into consideration least developed countries, the least amongst us, and which will actually give taxing rights to source countries, taking cognizance of their level of economic weight and allow them to benefit from the economic activity and the income that arises from the exploitation of their resources, not just natural resources, but also labor. We have quite a young population within Africa. We have a strong labor force. And so that is the process that we're seeing right now. And so with regard to particularly what African countries are looking forward to within this UN Framework Convention, of course, it's rectifying the imbalance of taxing rights, this historical wrong. I would like to believe that it was not intentional, this historical wrong. But then at the same time, when a lot of these rules were being developed, we didn't even have political independence. So maybe I shouldn't give the benefit of the doubt, because I do believe, just like other features of our economy, it just sort of perpetuated the extractive model, the extraction of our resources, including through tax revenue. And so that's something that we really, really want to address. So when you see African countries speak as passionately as they do within the room, please understand the history. Please understand where we're coming from. And also the other thing that we're trying to do is also develop rules that are actually simple and easy to administer. We want the least developed country amongst us with the least resourced tax administration to get some revenue. And I don't want to mention names of least developed countries, even though factually they are, but you have big companies that operate even in the most politically unstable one. You will find some corporate operating there, some corporate still managing to extract some level of income from those countries. And it's only fair that those countries also get an opportunity to use the revenue for for the delivery of public services and for the delivery of economic and social rights for their people. Because I want to make it very clear, tax is what funds public services in Africa. It is not ODA. Please, I know you're not, I know I'm not the person whom you imagine whenever you hear taxpayer, but I am a taxpayer. I am a taxpayer. And my late dad liked to say, because I benefited from the free education that we got from the Kenyan government, that he saw the value of the taxes that he paid in his lifetime, because through those taxes, people like me were able to be educated. So it's very, very important. It really does connect to public services and other aspects of public finance. So that's very important. So we need to make simple and easy to administer rules. And we also need to address the complexity of the rules right now, such as transfer pricing systems. Now, I know there's been a lot of effort through various mechanisms, such as, of course, the African Tax Administration Forum, to provide capacity. So it's Africans providing capacity, not other outsiders. I know there's been a lot of effort to grow and to capacitate tax pricing units in a lot of these African tax administrations. But also, you know, as lawyers and also as people who work on tax, it gives way to complex and expensive and lengthy disputes. And actually, when you look at the data, most of these disputes actually arise from transfer pricing. So why don't we simplify the rules and make everyone's lives easier? Why don't we just do that? It will be to the benefit of everyone, right? Why don't global north countries just allow us to also implement our own unilateral measures? Let us implement our digital services taxes. They're pretty low anyway, it's just 1.5. I mean, I pay 41. So let us implement our digital services taxes, because you also have to remember that the challenge when it comes to the complexity of these transfer pricing rules and other complex international tax rules is information asymmetries that exist between African tax administrations and developed tax administrations. Now, of course, tax transparency standards were also not developed by Africa, for Africa. They were developed by other people, and it suits their situations. And so for many African countries, we've not been able to truly address illicit financial flows, particularly commercially driven illicit financial flows, as well as aggressive tax avoidance and tax evasion, because of this lack of access to information. In fact, one of the things that we felt very uncomfortable with the two-pillar solution is that we could clearly see that country-by-country reporting was one of the was one of the pillars that was needed in order to make this measure successful, but it was still not being implemented well. And then when we ask for public country-by-country reporting, when we ask for public beneficial ownership registries, we are told data confidentiality, taxpayers' rights, not my rights, of course. I'm not a corporate, but the rights of corporates and the rights of high net worth individuals. And so we also want to address that. We also want tax transparency that works for us so that we can also adequately use this information in order to collect revenue and then, of course, use that revenue for the benefit of our people. So I hope that brief little history lesson has been entertaining enough. And has been a teachable moment for all of us. But truly, I think what we're asking for is just our fair share and nothing more. So it's only fair after about 100 years of benefiting from this system that you give some leeway. That would be very nice.
Thank you, Evelyn. I think now that you are all convinced and very motivated to get out of the very broken corporate tax system. And yes, we have clear proposal on how to get a corporate tax system that would work for all and be fair for once. And now I will go to Tony. So Tony Salvador of the Third World Network. The first early protocol discussed is about taxation of income derived for the provision of cross-border services in an increasingly digitalized and globalized economy, an issue that has been indeed central in the tax debate for a few years. So can you share with us your analysis and the expectation of civil society in that regard?
Thanks, Lison. Maybe I should give a brief background about myself. So I work with Third World Network on tax issues, but at the same time, I work a lot with the labor unions. So I'm part of the labor movement. And I was already part of the labor movement, kind of veteran in the labor movement when for some reason I ended up in one of the big four. I'm not a traitor, but anyway. So that was during the dot-com era. So I have some idea of what was going on in terms of tax planning of the big corporations. So yeah, so I think the issue of taxation of cross-border services in a digitalized economy is extremely important, especially because of the importance of intangible property. So more and more, a lot of value is being created and funneled to the rich countries because of the intangible property. So in terms of discussing this, I think the fact pattern is quite straightforward. So you have a corporation incorporated in a rich country, country A, typically developed industrial country, which provides services to clients located in country B. Typically, locals, local individuals or local corporations in a developing country. So once upon a time, this was possible only through commercial presence. No? And in fact, this has been addressed 30 years ago by GATS, no? The General Agreement on Trade and Services. It is called Mode 3 no? In GATS, commercial presence. And this commercial presence is precisely what is being treated in tax treaties. No? So a foreign non-resident corporation will be subject to tax in the market jurisdiction, we call it, only if it has a permanent establishment. So only if it has an office, representative office, a branch, a building site, construction site, a mining site, consultancy services, deployment of employees, etc., etc. But otherwise, it's not liable